Hello and welcome to this, the 5th episode of Mind the Gaps, a journey through popular culture. I'm your host, Jeremy. Well, things are looking up here at Podcast Central. I've gotten a lot of pretty good feedback from the folks who have listened to the previous shows, and I'm seeing my numbers kind of go up a little bit. As November rolls along, I just might be able to produce a third episode if time and effort allows. As you know, my theme for this month is politics, a scarier topic considering the current climate here in the United States. Now, I choose not to take a political stand on this show since, well, half of my audience will agree with me and half of my audience will not. And I think I would rather 100% of my audience come here for an escape from politics and agree that at least in this world, film trumps politics. And yes, that pun was intended. Some would say our current political climate is the worst it's ever been. And given my youth, I would probably agree with that sentiment. However, we can never really know what it was like prior to our existence in this world, so who knows how ugly it was in the 18th or 19th century? Who among my fellow members of Generation X can vouch for how ugly the Cold War of the 50s and 60s was? Growing up in the 80s, we had Reagan versus Gorbachev, Rocky versus Drago, and the Wolverines versus the Commies in Red Dawn. By the time the decade was over, the Cold War had effectively been finished with the destruction of the Berlin Wall. But in the 60s, the era of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev banging his shoe on the UN, and the Vietnam War, the world was full of uncertainty, and there really was a genuine climate of fear. At any moment, folks on both sides thought their enemies would begin a nuclear war at the drop of a hat. Obviously, the propaganda machines were fast at work. The Soviets had Pravda, and the United States, well, they had Hollywood. Which brings us to the title of the film that I will be watching today, The Manchurian Candidate. What do I know? Like most films from this era, I honestly don't know much about it. Starring Frank Sinatra and Janet Leigh, The Manchurian Candidate was released in 1962 and was based on a novel published in 1959. Here's an interesting tidbit. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place from October 16th to the 28th, 1962, and this film was released on October 26th, just before it was all over. What I think I know about the film is that it's about a political candidate that has been programmed by a communist government to infiltrate the American political system. With that in mind, I think it's safe to assume that the Manchurian Candidate of the title is probably young, charismatic, and driven. For all I know, the candidate that inspired this particular character could have been the young, charismatic senator-turned-president John F. Kennedy. Clearly, Kennedy wasn't a communist, but he was young and charismatic. I could be wrong, though. I noticed that Angela Lansbury is also in the film, which makes me wonder just how long that woman has been active in Hollywood. Growing up, I remember her first in Murder, She Wrote, then I remember seeing her in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and then hearing her as the voice of a teapot in Beauty and the Beast. And as far as I know, she's still working. And she's over 90 years old. She's a credit to hard work equaling longevity, if you ask me. Anyway, I digress. The bottom line, I don't know much about this film. I digress. The bottom line, I don't know much about this film. I know that there was another adaptation of the book in 2004 starring Denzel Washington, but I never saw that one either. I'm kind of a firm believer in trying to see the original first, and this will be no different. With that, on to the film. Alright, I have to admit, it's taken me a long time to watch this film. Longer than I would like to admit. I would start it late at night, then doze off, or start it and get distracted. It's not the fault of the film, it's just been a very crazy few weeks. I don't want to get into too many details, since this is a movie podcast, but it's more than just that. It's a journey, a travelogue through film. And since I'm the one traveling, it makes sense that I might go off on a tangent or two in the midst of preparing for a show. So, to make a long story short, I pulled a muscle in my back. It was excruciating. The moment it happened, I heard a pop. It was audible, like a gunshot, and then I felt an instant heat in my lower back. I curled up in the fetal position on the floor and lost all pretense of masculine toughness as I cried out in pain. My 2 sons were in the room with me, and they were baffled at what had just happened. Needless to say, I was horizontal for a few days while I let the inflammation die down. Now, one would think that this would be the perfect opportunity to get some serious film watching done. And don't get me wrong, I did get to indulge myself in entertainment. But the intense focus that I require of myself when watching a film for this podcast just wasn't in the reserves for me. So instead, I watched the 2nd season of Red Oaks, a dramatic sitcom on Amazon Prime. It was pretty good. And watched the Pauly Shore, Sean Astin film, Encino Man from the mid-90s instead. It was pretty bad, but in a good way. So I indulged in a lot of garbage film, but it was mostly because if I fell asleep I wouldn't feel too bad about missing out on anything. So I'm still recovering from my injury, but I've been working my way through the Manchurian Candidate slowly but surely. The film starts in a way that I'm not used to, particularly with older films. It starts with a cold open, establishing the setting of Korea in 1952 and the capture of a small American platoon across enemy lines. They've been betrayed by their interpreter and sent off to their doom at the hands of some very bad people, it seems. It's only after that brief scene that we see the opening credits, which are a lot like the opening credits of the time, but not very dynamic. The stars of the film are featured in still photos cleverly incorporated into a military-style shield. I honestly don't know what the technical term is for it, but it reminds me of the old Captain America shield. Here's a brief aside. The poster for this film has an interesting tagline. If you come in 5 minutes after this picture begins, you won't know what it's all about. When you've seen it all, you'll swear there's never been anything like it. It's also got some great illustrations of Sinatra and the rest of the cast. Movie posters of that era, they were a wonderful variety of design. Now, once the credits are over, we are thrown into the middle of a celebration. It's the homecoming for Raymond Shaw, a war hero. Shaw was a member of the platoon that had been captured in the cold open, and apparently his mother is married to a powerful senator. His relationship with his mother is one of the most complex I've ever seen on film. He clearly hates her, and she doesn't seem to like him all that much. Angela Lansbury's Eleanor Iselin seems to care less about her son being a war hero and more about how she can use that to further the political career of her husband, Raymond's stepfather. It's this complex relationship that is sort of the backbone of the film, while the rest is just dressing. Eleanor is probably the scariest character in the film. She's definitely not the sweet old grandmother or teapot or witch that I was used to seeing Lansbury portray before this. In this film, she has a sinister quality about her. The way she disparages a journalist as a communist is covered with disgust, as if she were talking about a gas station bathroom, and not a man. Throughout the early part of the film, we are shown just what happened during the time that the platoon was captured. The official story is that, being led by Shaw, this platoon was able to escape the clutches of their enemies after 3 days. But that's not the truth. And here's where the film excels. They're honestly the best scenes in the film. By using dream sequences as a plot device, we are shown that the men are in what they believe, a room full of gardening enthusiasts waiting out a rainstorm. But as time progresses, we are shown that the men only believe that they are in that room, and not in a room that is actually full of Chinese and Russian communists, who are demonstrating the programming that these men have all been through, a sort of hypnosis or brainwashing. But this is the brilliance of those scenes. Multiple characters are played by different actors throughout it. And the men, they are acting as though they are speaking to the same person, even though the actors get switched out from what is reality and what is in their heads. It's during these dream sequences that we witness the murder of 2 of the men at the hands of Raymond Shaw, our war hero. I'm not sure how I should feel about Shaw. He appears abrasive, angry, not the kind of guy who commands respect. But on 2 separate occasions, 2 of his men, when discussing him, robotically repeat this mantra: Raymond Shaw is the kindest, bravest, warmest, most wonderful human being I've ever known in my life. And this is where the film begins to really spread out among some key relationships. Bennett, played by none other than Frank Sinatra, is forced into a leave of absence where he meets a lovely young woman played by Janet Leigh. Shaw is approached by a young Korean man in search of a job, and he hires him. This is the same young Korean man who was their interpreter who betrayed Shaw and his platoon in Korea. But Shaw doesn't remember, and the young man doesn't remind him. And then we go back to Shaw's mother and stepfather, who are discussing the best way to spin their strategy of outing communists in the Department of Defense for their own political gain. In reality, if you look at each of these relationships, a lot of them are about deception. The Korean man is obviously assigned as a handler to Shaw, or something, as his memory fails him in regards to his true identity. There's one scene where Shaw's mother and stepfather are discussing just how many communists there are, the best number that they can settle on without him looking like a fool in front of his fellow politicians. It's clear that Lansbury's character is the person in charge of this relationship. She is so good at manipulating him that he doesn't realize he's being played. In the midst of all this deception, there was a clever product placement for Heinz, helping them finally settle on the number, 57. There is so much depth to this story, who is doing what, whose side each character is on, and what their motivations are. It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle. What it excels at, what it's really mastered is, confusing the viewer much like the brainwashed members of the platoon are, with Ben at the vanguard. We begin to unwrap this mystery from the same point that Bennett does. The twists, the turns, manipulations are so successful that there are no clues as to what direction the story is going. Confusion is usually a horrible storytelling tool, but this is a rare exception. It's a puzzle, and as the pieces fall into place, it makes for a beautiful picture.
As a public relations officer, you're a disaster.
I never wanted to...
Apparently, among other things, you permitted the secretary to make a number of unfortunate remarks to that idiot Iselin, which started him off on a rampage.
Mickey, listen to me, please. For the last 6 months, I've been driven nearly out of my mind by the same recurring dream.
The medical officer in charge...
What the hell does a medical corps know about intelligence work, Milt? I tell you, there's something phony going on. There's something phony about me, about Raymond Shaw, about the whole Medal of Honor business. For instance, when the psychiatrist asked me how I felt about Raymond Shaw, how I personally felt about him, and how the whole patrol felt about him, did you hear what I said? Did you really hear what I said? I said Raymond Shaw is the kindest, warmest, bravest, most wonderful human being I've ever known in my life. And even now I feel that way, this minute. And yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, something tells me it's not true. It's just not true. It isn't as if Raymond's hard to like. He's impossible to like. In fact, he's probably one of the most repulsive human beings I've ever known in all of my life.
At this point, it's really hard to write about this film without giving too much away. So if you haven't seen it yet, I would highly advise you to turn this episode off, find it at your local library, and watch it first. So, the titular character, the Manchurian Candidate, is Shaw, but it's less about his political aspirations and more about his programming and the conspiracy surrounding it. As I watched the story unfold, seeing the true colors of all the major players come to light, I was pleasantly surprised. It's rare in any film that you don't really know who you want to root for or against. When the heroes and villains are ambiguous, that can be either a stupid or brave choice for the writer. It's a fine line, razor thin. Where this film is successful is that it gives the viewer an opportunity to place the puzzle pieces in place through thoughtful exposition. When there is expositional dialogue, it's after you are given the chance to figure out the answer yourself. It does less to spell out the plot and more to explain character motivation. And in a film where it's hard to figure out why a character does what they do, it's helpful to have that expounded upon.
I know you will never entirely comprehend this, Raymond. But you must believe I did not know it would be you. I served them. I fought for them. I'm on the point of winning for them the greatest foothold they will ever have in this country. And they paid me back by taking your soul away from you. I told them to build me an assassin.